What if the very definition of success became an invisible trap, leading an empire to collapse in less than a decade? In 1998, a Finnish company, less than 150 years old, rose to become Europe's most valuable brand. It wasn't a bank, nor a car manufacturer. It was a factory born on the banks of a remote Finnish river, originally producing paper. That year, Nokia sold a mobile phone every 4 seconds. Every 4 seconds, somewhere on the planet, someone held a device with that green screen, that discrete antenna, and that unmistakable melody. At its peak, the company alone represented 4% of Finland's entire gross domestic product. It wasn't just a company. It was a nation within a nation. But in September 2013, Nokia's CEO stepped onto a stage in Helsinki and announced that the company's mobile phone division would be sold to Microsoft for 5.4 billion euros. It was the price of a defeat that took less than a decade to materialize. The man who had presided over the decline concluded his speech with words no one expected to hear from an executive before cameras from around the world. He said in a low voice, "We didn't do anything wrong, and yet we lost." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it echoed for years. This is the story of how the company that taught the world to communicate failed to listen to what the world was trying to tell it. It all began too far from the world of mobile phones for anyone to imagine what was to come. In 1865, an engineer named Frederick Idestam set up a small paper mill on the banks of the Nokianverta River in southwestern Finland. The location was as inhospitable as it was remote. But Idestam saw in the region's natural resources, abundant in wood and water, the potential to build something lasting. Within a few years, the factory prospered. In 1871, the company was named after the river that bathed it, Nokia. The name would sound poetic decades later, when it would be stamped on over 1 billion devices worldwide. Nokia spent the next century reinventing itself in ways that defied industrial logic. At different points in its history, it manufactured rubber boots, car tires, electrical cables, and even toilet paper. It was a survivor by nature, accustomed to navigating crises, shedding its skin whenever the market demanded. In 1967, a decisive merger occurred between the original Nokia, Finnish Cable Works, and Finnish Rubber Works, uniting 3 companies into a single conglomerate. This merger created the structure that would, years later, allow for an audacious dive into the sector that would change the company's destiny forever. The first steps towards telecommunications were timid. In 1979, Nokia partnered with TV manufacturer Salora and created Mobira Oy, a company dedicated to mobile telephony. In 1982, this division launched the Mobira Senator, the first car phone. It was an enormous, heavy, and absurdly expensive device, aimed exclusively at executives, with a battery the size of a briefcase. The world wasn't ready for a pocket-sized mobile phone yet, but Nokia was beginning to understand that this moment would arrive. In 1987, the company launched the Mobira Cityman, Nokia's first genuinely portable mobile phone. It weighed 800 grams, cost the equivalent of over 4,000 euros, and looked like a sophisticated brick. That same year, a photograph circulated in European newspapers and caused a sensation. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was seen on the streets of Helsinki, speaking into a Mobira Cityman. The device immediately earned the nickname Gorba and went down in history as a symbol of a new era, subtly telling the world that the frontiers of communication were about to disappear. The real turning point came in 1992. That year, Nokia made a strategic decision that would define the following decades. It gradually ceased its operations in traditional industrial sectors and concentrated all its resources on telecommunications. The new CEO, Jorma Ollila, a 41-year-old former banker, bet everything on a Nokia launch then emerging technology called GSM, the global standard for mobile communications being adopted across Europe. That same year, Nokia launched the Nokia 1011, the world's first mobile phone to operate with GSM technology. The device was simple, robust, and affordable by the standards of the time. It was the embryo of a revolution. In the following years, the world discovered it wanted to talk, and Nokia discovered it could manufacture devices for that better than any other company on the planet. In 1994, the Nokia 2110 became the first mobile phone with the iconic Nokia Tune ringtone, a melody based on a 19th-century guitar piece by Francisco Tárrega, which would become the most recognized sound in the history of consumer electronics. In 1998, the Nokia 5110 democratized access to mobile phones by combining a competitive price, long-lasting battery, and the ability to swap colorful covers. It offered personalization in an era that didn't yet grasp that concept in everyone's pocket. But it was the Nokia 3210, launched in 1999, followed by the 3310, that transformed Nokia into a global cultural phenomenon. These compact devices, without external antennas, with integrated games and text messaging, sold a staggering 160 million units. To put that into perspective, it was as if 1 in every 40 people on Earth had bought that specific mobile phone. People didn't identify their devices by brand, they identified them by number. You had a 3210, or a 3310, or an 8110. Nokia's models were so popular that their serial numbers became everyday language in dozens of countries. No technology company had achieved anything similar before. In 2000, Nokia surpassed Ericsson and Motorola, officially becoming the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer, a position it would hold for 14 consecutive years. In 2002, it launched the Nokia 6650, the first 3G phone on the planet. The company was always one step ahead, or so it seemed, because while Nokia's engineers celebrated their own records somewhere in the world, something was quietly being built that would soon change all the rules of the game. In 2003, Nokia launched the model many would consider the pinnacle of its traditional mobile phone trajectory, the Nokia 1100. Simple, inexpensive, practically indestructible, the device was designed specifically for emerging markets in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where electrical infrastructure was unstable and consumers needed a phone that would work in any condition. The Nokia 1100 sold 250 million units. It remains, to this day, the best-selling mobile phone in human history. 250 million devices that brought communication to people who had never imagined holding a phone in their hands. This was the power of a company that had become, in every practical sense of the word, indispensable. During that same period, Nokia dominated 40% of the global mobile phone market. Its research laboratories employed over 20,000 engineers worldwide. Its offices were located in 120 countries. Finland, a Nordic country of just 5 million inhabitants, had produced the most influential technology company on the planet. It was an improbable story that seemed to have no limit. Nokia's market value exceeded 300 billion euros in the early 2000s, making it more valuable than companies like Ford, Volkswagen, and Sony combined. The world was in its hands, literally, but something was happening deep within the industry that the current numbers couldn't reveal. In 2004, Nokia began to show the first signs of vulnerability. That year's launches didn't resonate as before. Exotic models with swivel formats and bold designs generated curiosity, but not sales. The company's market share fell for the first time in years, receding to 35%. It was a small drop, almost imperceptible given the size of the empire. But numbers never lie when you know how to read them. The problem was rooted deeper than any market analyst dared publicly admit. Nokia had built its dominance in a hardware world where competitive advantage lay in material quality, battery durability, and signal clarity. It was the best in the world at this, but the market was very slowly and almost invisibly becoming a software world. And software was not what Nokia did best. The company's operating system, Symbian, had been developed in the 1990s to run on devices with limited memory and slow processors. It was efficient for what it was designed to do, but creating applications for it was an expensive, slow, and technically hostile task for external developers. In a market that still saw mobile phones as simple communication tools, this problem seemed irrelevant. But the market was about to shift paradigms in a way that Nokia underestimated, with a confidence only prolonged success can produce. On January 9, 2007, in San Francisco, Steve Jobs took the stage at the Macworld Expo and put his hand in his pocket. When he pulled it out, there was something small, rectangular, and entirely covered in glass between his fingers. There was no physical keyboard, no visible antenna. There was only a screen that responded to touch with a fluidity never before seen in a mobile device. Jobs said Apple was launching 3 different products that day: a widescreen iPod, a revolutionary phone, and an internet communicator. The audience began to realize, with growing enthusiasm, that he was talking about the same device. It was the iPhone, and it changed the world forever. In Nokia's hallways, the initial reaction was one of calculated disdain. Finnish executives looked at the technical specifications of the first iPhone and found enough reasons for reassurance. Apple's device lacked 3G connectivity. Its camera was only 2 megapixels. Its battery lasted less than a day with intense use. The Nokia N95, launched that same year, had a 5-megapixel camera, 3G support, and a considerably more robust battery. In terms of hardware, Nokia still won, and it was precisely this interpretation that led the company to the biggest strategic mistake in its history. What Nokia failed to understand, or refused to understand, was that the iPhone wasn't just a better phone. It was a new product category. It was a pocket computer with an intuitive interface, an ecosystem of applications that was about to be born, and a user-centric experience in a way that Symbian had never been able to offer. Apple wasn't competing in the same game Nokia was playing. It had invented an entirely new game, and Nokia kept playing the old one. In 2008, Google launched Android, an open-source operating system that any manufacturer could use for free. Samsung, LG, HTC, and dozens of other companies adopted Android with impressive speed. In April 2009, Samsung launched its first Android smartphone, the i7500, less than 2 years after the iPhone's debut. The following year, Samsung definitively abandoned Symbian. The race had begun, and Nokia was still at the starting line, looking at the horizon, with an expression that mixed disbelief and wounded pride. Internally, the company was experiencing a silent crisis that rarely made headlines. Nokia's organizational structure had grown as much as its market share. It was a heavy bureaucracy, divided into internal fiefdoms that competed among themselves as much as they competed with external rivals. Decisions that should have taken weeks took months. Promising projects died in committees before reaching the market. Engineers who tried to warn leadership about the risks of Symbian were met with institutional resistance. Over years of uninterrupted success, the company had developed what management scholars call the winner's curse, the inability to see real threats, because a glorious past seems sufficient guarantee for the future. In 2010, Nokia's smartphone market share had fallen to 34%. The number still seemed high in absolute terms, but the speed of the decline was alarming to anyone who understood the pace at which the industry moved. Apple's App Store already boasted 250,000 available applications. The Android ecosystem was growing exponentially, and Nokia was still trying to make Symbian work in an era that had already left Symbian behind. It was in this scenario of increasing urgency that Nokia's board of directors made a decision that seemed surgical, but which, over time, would reveal all the contradictions of a company that had lost clarity about what it was and what it wanted to be. In September 2010, Nokia hired Stephen Elop, a Canadian executive directly from Microsoft, as its CEO. It was the first time in Nokia's history that a foreigner had taken the company's top leadership role. It was also, as many would later realize, the beginning of the end. In February 2011, Stephen Elop sent an internal memo to Nokia employees, which leaked to the press and became one of the most commented documents in recent corporate history. In the text, Elop compared Nokia to a man standing on a burning oil platform in the middle of the ocean. The structure was on fire. The sea around was icy and unknown, and the only choice left was to jump. It was a brutal, honest, and in many respects, accurate metaphor. The problem was that the man who wrote it already knew what the next step would be, even before delivering the diagnosis. A few days after the memo, Elop announced a strategic partnership with Microsoft. Nokia's future smartphones would abandon Symbian and run Windows Phone, Microsoft's mobile operating system. The decision shook the market, confused consumers, and devastated Nokia's internal morale. Developers working on Symbian and MeeGo, the alternative operating system Nokia had developed in partnership with Intel, which showed promising results, saw years of work discarded overnight. The Nokia N9, the only device launched with MeeGo, received enthusiastic reviews from specialized press in 2011. It was fast, fluid, intuitive, and elegant, but it was launched and discontinued almost simultaneously, as if Nokia itself had decided to bury its best chance before it could flourish. The partnership with Microsoft produced the Lumia line, smartphones with colorful designs and exceptional cameras, especially the Lumia 1020, launched in 2013, with a 41-megapixel photographic sensor that was technologically superior to practically everything else on the market. The PureView technology developed by Nokia's engineers was genuinely revolutionary, but Windows Phone failed to attract developers. The app library was scarce. Users who migrated to a Lumia discovered that essential applications simply did not exist on the platform. Nokia had traded a dying operating system for one that never truly came to life. The numbers told an increasingly bleak story. In 2011, Nokia's smartphone market share had fallen to 15%. In 2012, it dropped to 7%. By the first half of 2013, it reached 3%. From half of the world market to 3% in less than 6 years. It was an unprecedented decline in the history of the technology industry. The dissolution of an empire built over decades, consumed in a time frame that would barely fit an electoral cycle. The company's shares, which had reached €65 around 2000, traded below €3 in 2012. Layoffs came in waves. In 2011, Nokia announced 700 job cuts. In 2012, another 1,000. Factories that had operated for decades were closed. Offices that represented the company's global presence were shut down. In Finnish cities where Nokia had built entire communities, the feeling was one of collective mourning. Salo, a city of 50,000 inhabitants in southern Finland, had become practically dependent on the local Nokia factory. When the factory closed in 2012, the city entered an immediate economic crisis. Nokia was not just a company for Finland, it was part of the national identity, and its fall was felt as a personal loss by millions of people. In September 2013, the inevitable was announced. Microsoft acquired Nokia's mobile device division for €5.4 billion. Stephen Elop returned to Microsoft as part of the deal. Many analysts, with the distance that time allows, began to question whether Elop's hiring had been, from the outset, a strategic maneuver by Microsoft to prepare Nokia for an acquisition. The theory was never proven, but the sequence of decisions, seen in retrospect, fueled the suspicion with disturbing logic. Nokia's board denied any conspiracy. History recorded the doubt. Microsoft kept the Nokia brand for a few years on Lumia devices, but the project never took off. In 2015, Microsoft announced a $7.6 billion write-down related to the Nokia acquisition, a formal recognition that the deal had been a complete financial failure. The following year, Microsoft sold the remaining assets of the mobile division for just $350 million, an infinitesimal fraction of the value paid years earlier. It was the final chapter of a saga that had begun on the banks of a Finnish river 150 years prior. The Nokia name survived. In 2016, the Finnish company licensed the brand to HMD Global, a startup formed by former Nokia executives who began manufacturing Nokia-branded smartphones running Android. The devices were competent, affordable, and honest, but no one referred to them by serial number. No one treated them as objects of desire. They were just mobile phones, with a nostalgic name stamped on the back. Nokia had become an emotional memory of something that was once extraordinary. What truly remained was the question Elop tried to answer on that stage in Helsinki. His voice choked with emotion before the world's cameras. How could a company that did nothing wrong lose everything? The answer is more complex than any memo can capture. Nokia did not err due to technical incompetence. Its engineers were brilliant. It did not err due to lack of resources. It invested $40 billion in research and development in the last decade of its dominance. It erred because it confused excellence with invincibility. It erred because it believed the world would continue to evolve within the rules it had helped create. And it erred because, when the world completely changed its rules, it wasted precious time trying to understand if it should change along with it. The story of Nokia carries lessons that transcend the world of mobile phones and speak directly to the nature of power, innovation, and survival in any field. The first is that market leadership is always temporary, And the greatest risk faced by those at the top is not incompetence, but complacency. Nokia knew the world was changing. It had the data, the engineers, the resources. What it lacked was the humility to recognize that its own success had become the biggest obstacle to its transformation. The second lesson is that, in technology-driven markets, winning in hardware is never enough when the real battle shifts to software and ecosystems. Nokia manufactured the best phones in the world at a time when the world stopped wanting just phones. Consumers didn't want a more durable device or a better camera. They wanted a universe of possibilities in their pocket. And that universe was built by developers, not factories. The third lesson is perhaps the most silent and profound. Organizations that grow too large often develop a dangerous immunity to external reality. Nokia was not destroyed by its enemies. It was destroyed by the distance that had grown over years of absolute success between what its leaders believed the world wanted and what the world was, in fact, asking for, in an increasingly loud voice. On the banks of the Nokian River, where it all began in 1865, the water continues to flow, indifferent to the empires that rise and fall on its banks, always moving forward, always changing, never looking back.